Good evening, everyone. I'm Sarah Krotz, the director of the Centre for Literatures in Canada, the Centre de Littérature au Canada, and it's my pleasure to welcome you all to the 19th annual Henry Kreisel Memorial Lecture tonight, which will be delivered in just a few moments by David A. Robertson. And I'm pleased to share the podium this evening with Dr. Robert Wood, the Dean of the Faculty of Arts. Before we get things started, we have a few important acknowledgements. First, and most important, is an expression of gratitude that we can all gather here tonight on Treaty 6 territory and the Métis Nation of Alberta District 9 and 10. In our work as the Centre for Literary Research and Creative Exchange, the CLC aims to celebrate and honor the Indigenous storytelling traditions that have animated these lands since time immemorial. We strive, above all, to create hospitable spaces for the ongoing flourishing of this place as what the Nehiawak refer to as a pehonan, a gathering place that is cosmopolitan, diverse, and inclusive. As Dean Wood will elaborate in just a moment, Professor Henry Kreisel, for whom this lecture is named, modeled the intellectual humanity, hospitality, and creative vision that inspires not just this lecture series, but much of the CLC's work. The events that the CLC offers throughout the year, and especially this one, require many hundreds of tasks behind the scenes to pull off. And so I want to thank my two CLC staff, Helena and Nicole, a small but mighty CLC team. You are truly amazing. Many thanks too to Aman, our research assistant, and our crew of volunteers tonight, to Cindy and Catherine, to Grant Wang, and the TIMS staff. We could not do any of this work or host this lecture tonight without the support of generous donors, sponsors, and partners. Every contribution helps, so thank you so much. Special thanks to the sponsors of this year's lecture, the Kuhl Institute for Advanced Study, the Department of English and Film Studies, the Alumni Office, and last but certainly not least, the Faculty of Arts. Thank you so much for your support, and welcome, Dean Wood.
Thank you, Dr. Krotz. Good evening, everyone. My name is Robert Wood, and I'm privileged to serve as the Dean of the Faculty of Arts at the University of Alberta, where we're proud to be home to the Centre for Literatures in Canada. This successful research centre bridges diverse scholarly and creative communities as the Western hub of Canadian literary scholarship. The CLC is an open forum for inclusive critical thinking and cultural engagement. And it also works to bring together authors, readers, researchers, students, and teachers from across the country. You can learn more about the CLC's many events and initiatives on their website or sign up for the newsletter through the QR code on the back of tonight's program. I'd like to thank our friends at the CLC who make all of this possible, particularly Dr. Sarah Wiley-Krotz and her team at the CLC. As many of you know, the Kreisel Lecture is an annual lecture series established by the CLC in memory of Professor Henry Kreisel. Throughout the 1950s, 60s, and 70s, Dr. Kreisel was a beloved professor who also served as chair of English and also the vice president academic at the University of Alberta. Professor Kreisel was Jewish and Austrian-born, and he was interned in Canada during the Second World War. As a war refugee, he spoke of being an accidental immigrant to Canada who, as a newcomer, went looking for Canadian literature, but no one could tell him where to find it. And so he took matters into his own hands, introducing and teaching the first courses in Canadian literature at the University of Alberta, inspiring a love of the written word in generations of students, many of whom still remember his humane and inspiring teaching. Notably, he was one of the first modern writers to introduce the immigrant experience to the field of Canadian literature. Professor Kreisel was also among the first leaders at the U of A to recognize the importance of building bridges between the university and local Indigenous communities. We remain inspired by Professor Kreisel's efforts to make our university and literary communities more prosperous, diverse, and inclusive. We're also grateful for the support of the members of the Kreisel family. The CLC honors the legacy through the Kreisel Lecture Series, just as the Faculty of Arts is committed to honoring and supporting literary arts and spreading awareness about the importance and the value of Canadian literature. Thank you to the University of Alberta Press, which co-publishes the Kreisel series with the Centre for Literatures in Canada. And of course, I also want to express my deep gratitude to Eric and to the late Alexis Schloss for their generous founding gift and for their continued support over the years. Dr. Eric Schloss proposed the original concept and vision for the CLC because he saw the need for an organization devoted solely to studying and celebrating Canadian literature in the broadest context, nationally and internationally. In addition to donating more than 40,000 books to University of Alberta libraries and supporting annual lectureships on human rights and the Holocaust, the Schloss has established the Centre for Literatures in Canada in the Faculty of Arts in 2006, the only national bilingual literature centre in Canada. We remain forever grateful for their generosity and vision.
It's now our pleasure to welcome to the stage Connor Kerr, who will introduce our speaker tonight. Connor Kerr, as many of you know, is a national award-winning and losing, those are his words, not mine, Métis Ukrainian writer living in Edmonton, and an assistant professor in the English and Film Studies department here at the U of A. A member of the Métis Nation of Alberta, he was raised in Saskatoon, Buffalo Pound, Drayton Valley, and other prairie towns and cities. And he told me just today that he would never live in any city other than Edmonton, Saskatoon, or Winnipeg, so he's a real prairie devotee. Connor is the author of 5 books, including the Governor General's shortlisted poetry collection, Old Gods, the Relit award-winning and Giller long-listed novel, Avenue of Champions, and the Giller Prize shortlisted novel, Prairie Edge.
In addition to being an accomplished writer who tells stories that need to be told, Kerr has worked with diverse Indigenous and youth communities around Edmonton. Please join us in welcoming Connor Kerr.
Good evening, everyone. My grandmother's name is Pat Kerr. Before she was married, it was Pat Ginther. She's a proud Métis woman who is descended from the Métis communities around Edmonton, as well as the Papas-Chase Cree Nation, whose land we are currently on right now. Land that was illegally surrendered officially in 1888, even after her great-grandfather, a man named John Quinn Gladue, under the guidance of the matriarchs, negotiated and signed an adhesion to Treaty 6. My grandmother was raised by her grandmother, affectionately known in our family as Granny, on road allowances north of St. Paul, Alberta. Granny was born on the Papas-Chase Cree Nation and left as a young woman when government officials killed their livestock, dogs, and burned down their houses to make way for what would become Strathcona. My grandmother was raised by Granny and learned the stories of this land. Granny would tell her about how her umbilical cord is buried right where the low-level bridge is now. She would tell her about which trails had the best Saskatoon bushes. She talked about how the Mill Creek Ravine would echo throughout the nights with fiddle music and drums as people gathered. She talked about how much landscapes, home, community, and pride in who you are, where you come from, and who your community is means everything. As we sit here today on lands that Indigenous communities have called home forever, I want us to honor their stories, their laughter that echoes throughout the river valley, their tears and joy that the North Saskatchewan carries forever east. Let's honor that, acknowledge that, and think about it as we move through our daily lives. I was raised by my grandmother, and she taught me from a young age to be proud to be Métis. She taught me our family history, our family story, and what it means to hold relationships and culture near to your heart. Not many kids my age had that same opportunity. In the late 90s, when I was a kid, we'd drive from Buffalo Pound Lake to Moose Jaw, Saskatoon, and I'd get dropped off at the library. I remember looking for characters and stories that resembled me or my friends and the communities that we came from. And there wasn't much out there. There were no graphic novels, there was no young adult books, there were no children's books, anything like that. We might have found the book that Kreisel wrote, and that was kind of all we had at that time. Holy! Do I wish that I'd been hitting up that library in Moose Jaw now. Over the past 15 years, David Robertson has written over 25 books across multiple genres, including nonfiction, children's, and young adult books and novels. I'm not gonna lie, I was initially planning on listing all of them out, but that would have taken half the lecture. So I'll just list a couple of my personal favorites, which include the Governor General Award-winning When We Were Alone, the Carol Shields Winnipeg Book Award-winning Blackwater, Family Legacy and Blood Memory, the Reckoner Rises series, and the Misawa Saga, the novel Theory of Crows, and the Governor General Award-winning On the Trapline. To say that David Robertson is prolific is an understatement. He has created in a short period of time an entire canon for Indigenous and non-Indigenous youth and adults across the country to learn more about colonialism, foster care, residential schools, reconciliation, mental health, and their effects on Indigenous kids and families. These are hard topics to discuss. It takes a lot of courage to approach them, and it would be easy to dwell on the negative. But one thing about David's writing is that he approaches it from a place of strength. The legendary Haisla Hetzick writer and Kreisel lecture alumnus, Eden Robinson, said of David's book Blackwater, that when someone lives their life in a good way, the Haisla call them handsome people. David A. Robertson's biography is a perfect example of someone who takes care with his words and speaks respectfully. He tackles identity and racism, family bonds and breaks with nuance and honesty. Another Kreisel lecture alumnus, Heather O'Neill, said that he explores Cree values and ideas and their richness and relevance in contemporary life. He does so by taking us through the story of one Indigenous family's journey through the 20th century in Canada. We are faced with horrors and great loss, but also extraordinary warmth and heroics, and a family who refused to ever be defined by anyone but themselves. A wondrous history lesson about love. Born to educators Donald and Bev, David, a father of 5. Imagine raising 5 kids and also writing 25 plus books in 15 years. Very, very, very impressive. David graduated from the University of Winnipeg in 1999. Indigenous worldviews and educational concepts are a constant thread throughout his work, where they are situated within a contemporary context. As he stated in an interview with the Quill Enquirer, we have trauma in our history, in our lives, in our family, but really our story is a story of resiliency and a story of cultural reconnection and a story of love. I feel like that will help people understand what healing really means. I first met David in June of 2022 in Toronto at the Amazon Walrus debut novel award ceremony. My novel, Avenue of Champions, had been shortlisted for the award. It lost. But I was attending my first literary event ever. I had never thought that a book about Métis youth and their experiences growing up in Edmonton would be considered for any national awards, and going to a place like the Globe and Mail building in downtown Toronto was incredibly intimidating. As I walked into the gala, I felt overwhelmed. Here was this community of really fancy and interesting Toronto writers. But then, in the corner, there was David A. Robertson, looking as handsome as ever, chatting with Sherry Demelin and Joshua Whitehead, and it was just so comforting knowing that there were Indigenous peoples who had paved the way in these spaces. As I mentioned, I didn't win that award, but being able to meet and talk to a Cree writer from Winnipeg who was part of a community that was shaping a new collective of Indigenous literary works made the night and the trip worth it. I ran into David again this past fall at Calgary's WordFest. We talked briefly in the author room as he was grabbing a bite to eat after having spent the entire day talking to kids at schools across Calgary. The night before that, he had been on back-to-back panels. I would have been exhausted. David looked excited still, and he told me a brief story about how inspirational the kids were at a junior high he had spoken at earlier that day, how their questions gave him hope for how future generations are seeing relationships with Indigenous peoples. David's writing and the lectures that he gives consider what an ideal future can look like for both Indigenous and non-Indigenous peoples on these lands. I think back to when I was a kid in those libraries in Moose Jaw, Saskatoon, and how I would have felt if David's works had been available for me. And I think about how all across this country, Indigenous youth are picking up his books and seeing their stories reflected in literature, and how they will be proud of who they are and the beautiful families, histories, and communities that they come from. That multi-generational impact is immeasurable. David was recently named the editorial director of Swiftwater Books, an Indigenous children's book imprint of Penguin Random House Canada's Tundra Books. The name pays homage to his late father's love of water. In 2023, David was awarded an honorary doctorate in letters by the University of Manitoba, and in May of this year, the University of Lethbridge will be awarding him an honorary doctorate of laws. His most recent work, All the Little Monsters, How I Learned to Live with Anxiety, was published in January of this year by HarperCollins. It is one of the honors of my life to be able to welcome David A. Robertson, a member of Norway House Cree Nation in beautiful Manitoba, to deliver the 2025 Kreisel Lecture.
I think Connor did a good job. I think my job's done, I think. Thanks for asking me to be here. Thanks for coming. I was just telling Sarah, I grew up with in Winnipeg, Dr. Kreisel. I just want to thank Connor for that very generous introduction. I remember meeting him the last few times. I was so impressed by not just like his talent as a writer, but his qualities as a human. What a great guy. Anyway, so here we go. Writing is social activism. I want to quote Atwood to start. Writing stories imagines future readers, and in so doing, imagines a future influenced by those stories. And maybe it's just me. Well, me and Margaret. When I made the active decision to become a published author, I wanted to create social change through inspiring action. I envisioned my books being taught in classrooms and stocked on library shelves. I didn't much care for mass market success. Don't get me wrong, being able to put food on the table for my family is something I'm grateful for. And to pay for hockey and school and dance and hockey. Did I mention hockey? I also have a goalie now, double hockey. But I never expected to get where I am today in a million years. What I did expect was to make a difference in some small manner. I attribute that expectation to the influence of my father. For decades, he worked in the field of Indigenous education and was a trailblazer. He was an innovator. The stuff we are working towards today, or that we recognize as necessities, but still haven't developed and implemented for the success of Indigenous youth in remote and urban locations, he was talking and writing about in the early 1990s. I carry an essay of his around called Speaking in Tongues, wherever I go. And here's a quick excerpt. The education system has improved with some cultures. For example, a teacher can no longer stand in front of French students and teach in English unless they are teaching English. The education system has taken the language of the French people and their culture into consideration, and they cannot teach without including the student's culture and experience. What about Cree people? Can teachers stand in front of the Cree student without knowledge of the student's language, culture, and experience? The reality is, educational institutions have not taken the experience of the Crees into consideration. Cree language and culture are not required for certification or teaching in schools, urban, rural, northern, or Indigenous. Years ago, I asked Dad why he didn't take better paying jobs, or why he'd never accepted one of the many invitations to run for a political party. He told me that he only took jobs that would enable him to help the most people. Money or notoriety was never considered. If anything, notoriety was helpful as a way for him to work with a bigger platform and positively affect even more people than he would have been able to otherwise. I try to keep that in mind too, especially when I'm at a school and signing arms and hands and shirts and hat bills and the soles of shoes and ripped up pieces of paper and sometimes even books. It helps keep my feet on the ground and my head comfortably fitting through doorways. The only place I ever feel popular is at a school or an education conference, by the way. How could I have had such an expectation, though? I wonder if it doesn't sound like hubris was involved in that ambition, envisioning that my work would be able to make a difference. I often quote Edward Everett Hale. Dad had this taped to the inside of the last notebook he kept. He kept copious notebooks. And the quote is, "I am only one, but still I am one. I cannot do everything, but still I can do something. And I can't let the fact that I can't do everything stop me from doing the one thing that I can do." That guides my entire career. You know, you get one tattoo, you get lots. I even got it translated into Cree. I translated it into syllabics, and I got it tattooed on my wrist. So I'll never forget what that means, that quote, and how it drives what I do. I think it boils down to is anybody has the capability of doing something that will make a lasting impact. Several years ago, a handful of my books, all of them graphic novels, were banned in Alberta. First, throughout the Edmonton public school system. I thought of that one because proximity. And then I was informed by the entire province of Alberta through Alberta Education. In fact, I was told recently that some of my books are still not recommended for use here. In both cases, most of the books that were targeted, and I don't use that word frivolously, book bannings are targeted attacks. That's why the vast majority of books that are challenged and eventually banned are from the LGBTQI2S+ community. Were books about and by Indigenous people. In all cases, the rationale behind the decision to ban the book in question was suspect at best, and asinine at worst. For example, my first published book, 7 Generations, A Plains Cree Saga, was banned due to an inaccurate depiction of Indigenous culture. I'm Indigenous, by the way, just in case we weren't clear about that. Okay. There's this thing called like lived experience and own voices. Anyway, and that let me say this clearly too, it required teachers to have pre and post conversations with students about the impacts and legacy of the Indian residential school system. In short, it required teachers to do their jobs. On the part of Alberta Education, a teacher was told to stop using Betty, the Helen Betty Osborne story, because it inferred that violence occurred and that the author, me, was problematic. I guess speaking out about book bannings ironically contributes to decisions that get your book banned. More recently, a school board in Ontario, the Durham District School Board, I'll name everything, by the way. This is the one time I'll go off my speech. I was in the Waterloo Catholic District School Board. A couple of my friends, Danny Ramadan and Robin Stevenson, among a few others, had their books pulled because they were from the LGBTQI2S community. And I was supposed to go there to do a tour of the schools. And I told them I wasn't going to go unless they put their books back on the shelves. And then I stopped for a second, and in a few days I thought about it, and I thought, you know what? I'm going to go. I'm going to tell every single kid there that they should be able to read those books. And that's what I did. So, Durham District School Board pulled 3 books off shelves and out of classrooms, circumventing their own policy to address book challenges to begin with. They asked that I refer to their Indigenous policy, which in turn referred me back to the division policy, including the Great Bear. Their reasoning stood up to scrutiny about as well as Edmonton and Alberta's, and frankly, as well as almost any book challenge. That's because book challenges often come from parents or grandparents who don't bother to even read the title in question. They see the word gay and think, oh no, not on my watch, without bothering to read the actual words. And by the way, this isn't necessarily a discussion on book banning, but I can, look, challenging books by marginalized authors doesn't erase the fact that marginalized people live in our communities. They are a part of our communities. They erase marginalized people in the same way that tearing down a statue of an architect of genocide erases history. The primary reason for banning the Great Bear, along with harming Indigenous children, was that it was the school board's policy not to teach culture. A dramatic pause. All books are culture. Every single book is culture. What the school board's policy was, it seems, was to not teach some culture. Let me break down for a second. Books, and all books, are keepers of cultural heritage and history. They hold collective wisdom, traditions, and stories within their pages that span generations. They are iconic cultural entities, and seeing them for what they are allows us to capture and preserve their intrinsic and lasting value. Stories are forever. The wisdom my father gifted me with has been gifted to my children, and that cycle will continue. Stories are forever unless we allow them to be snuffed out by fear and ignorance. If it's true that all stories are culture, it's not a stretch to hold as truth that all stories are as well political. If books, stories are keepers of cultural heritage and history, they are also inherently political. Stories are the expression of one's beliefs or ideology to somebody else. In the case of books, that somebody else is the reader, the consumer of the words that have been placed onto the page with great care, precision, and thought. Stories are a gift. They transfer knowledge from one to another. The reader processes the information with which they have been gifted. If the storytelling is compelling, concise, creative, and relevant, the reader cannot help but be changed and what's more, motivated by it. I'm going to talk about reconciliation a lot in this lecture. I think it's inevitable given my line of work. I will also break down the term to better articulate what sort of activism writing can inspire, because you cannot act effectively on something that is a misnomer. But hold on a minute or two for that. Now, my father, as well as being dad, was my best friend, my role model, my mentor, and my hero. I do everything I do because of the example he set for me in his work. Sometimes our work intersected. We would find each other at the same conference. We would go for lunch together or take turns watching each other present and rate each other on the presentations. Usually one. Me on something to do with books and Dad with something to do with education. Of course, the two can be synonymous. Books should educate as much as they should entertain. That's why my father's teaching hits so hard and so effectively. What he told me about his focus in the work he did was what I saw in my focus as an author, and eventually the other sandboxes I would play in. It should come as no surprise that he and I spoke often of reconciliation. We both appreciated concision. Say what you're going to say in as few words as possible. By the way, I know that's not what you're getting here, but I've got an hour to play with. What was the simplest way to describe the act of reconciliation? Well, it was a process of communication for both of us, of two people sitting across from one another, or one person standing in front of several people and having a conversation. The trick is to do so without any inherent bias, something that we all carry with us, whether we'd like to admit it or not. So we see through all that bullshit, all that luggage we carry with us, i.e. an Indigenous person will probably wear moccasins, have their hair braided, may talk in that familiar res accent, be stoic, and so on. And by the way, if that's what you were expecting, surprise, my uniform is jeans and a t-shirt. This is actually fancy for me. It was called a shacket, a shirt jacket. And I wear this no matter who I'm speaking to. And guess what? I have no less Cree than anybody in my home community of Norway House Cree Nation, or Kinneseo-Sipi, which means Fish River. I once asked my father why he never taught me to be Cree. He looked at me and all funny, and he asked, "How am I going to teach you how to be Cree? You are Cree. Nothing I say will make you more or less Cree." Anyway, we push all those preconceptions and expectations aside. We see each other as human beings and connect on that level in sharing the human condition. We have all experienced love, loss, joy, and grief. We can also have shared values, even if we present them differently. And so the more we understand what brings us together, the more we learn about what our differences are and work to understand them through this clear lens. The clearer we can see where we have been, where we are because of it, and where we need to go in order to live well with each other in a stronger and safer community, where the successes of one contributes to the success of all. You cannot fix a problem unless you know there is one and have a good understanding of what those barriers are. That's how you break those barriers down. Just as we share so much in being human and living with the human condition, stories in all their forms share things also. Every single form of writing, from books in all their forms and genres, picture books, graphic novels, poetry, novels, fiction, nonfiction, historical fiction, fantasy, sci-fi, horror, short stories, flash fiction, memoir, to blog posts, to social media posts, to articles and op-eds, to Saturday morning comics, to journals, to speeches, to translations, to emails. They're all distinct. Still, they share one thing, if one thing only: knowledge transfer. I mentioned it tonight already, but it's worth repeating. My biography used to say it, because what you write down is forever. I'll still hear it a lot when I'm introduced, that David writes book that educates as much as they entertain. And this is true, I hope. I hope the entertaining part, I hope. Stories can do both. They ought to do both, and even more. Stories reveal the world around us in all of its beauty, in all of its warts, in all the challenges we face, in the successes we achieve by overcoming those challenges, and in the failures we experience, what we learn from those failures when we do not overcome the challenges we are presented with. Stories reveal the world around us, and more than that, articulate our place in it. Stories provide commentary on historical and contemporary events to better understand where we are from and where we have been. If you have that awareness, you have been gifted in some way through story. And so, all stories are political, and within the context of this conversation, all stories are a call to action. This is why stories, books, writing are a form of activism. That's why when you write a story, you should accept the responsibility of the activism they encourage. Activism requires resultant action, or else can we call it activism at all? It calls for change nothing unless action follows. This is why the first thing I want to dive into after 20 minutes, the first thing, or the third thing I want to dive into is those that would silence the very tools of activism, of tools that influence, inspire, and motivate our most vital agents of change. So let me return to an earlier tangent. I was talking about book banning. I mentioned policy, how the school board in question had established a policy to handle book challenges, which people have a right to do. You can challenge a book. Even if the reasons are ignorant and uninformed, you can still challenge a book. Dave Levithan wrote a book called Answers in the Pages that addressed book bannings of stories about and by the LGBTQI2S+ community. In the book, a parent reads the last paragraph of a book where two boys hug, just hug. And based on that very gay action, the boys are gay, but so what? I hug everybody all the time. I hugged Connor just now. I love hugging. The mother initiates a challenge that leads to the book being pulled from classrooms. What Levithan gives us in the book is the ability to read the story that was banned, not just the last paragraph. And it provides much needed context. what the parents should have bothered to gather. It's a coming-of-age adventure story where two characters, boys, happen to have feelings for each other. Levithan offers a roadmap to consider how policy can better handle book challenges. His book is Writing as Activism. It's a story that inspires a movement towards social change. In this case, what does policy do when books are challenged, and what does it truly protect? By the way, I don't think I wrote this. I'll mention a bit more about this, but later, but not the specific thing. If you're going to have a policy to handle book challenges, part of that policy needs to be the person challenging the book needs to have read the book. Parents or grandparents who lead calls to challenge books by marginalized groups might say that these stories protect their children from indoctrination, as though a novel can make you gay. I mean, as far as I know, if you're gay, you're gay. It's like my father telling me that I was Cree. How am I going to teach you how to be Cree, he asked. Well, how can you teach somebody to be gay? You can't. You're either gay or you aren't gay. You don't choose to be gay. Calls to ban books are ostensibly done to protect children. But do children need to be protected? Does it protect a child to ignore people who live in your community? Does it protect anybody to ignore the existence of human beings who live with us in our communities? I would argue that it harms us, and it certainly harms children. It takes stories away from them. No, children don't need to be protected. They're doing just fine. And their empathy and acceptance is something we can all learn from. A policy that addresses book challenges should not be focused on protecting children. It should be put in place to protect books. Writing in any form that addresses policy or motivates some action that can lead to change is critical for reaching an ultimate goal of reform and the respective calls for action. Now, I write a lot from lived experience. The focus of my writing has always been activism. It has always been a question that I ask myself, a litmus test for whether I move forward with a story or leave it on the cutting room floor. I ask myself not only if what I am writing is a good story, but whether or not it can create meaningful change. I don't move forward with it if it cannot, even if I feel like it's a great concept. That's why I can confidently say that every single book I've written, every single podcast script I've developed, every article I've taken on, every story I've told in person has had the goal of creating social change. We all should have a similar goal, no matter what discipline we choose to work in. The prospect of creating any measurable change is daunting. We have to have a vision of a long-term impact. My father used to tell me that any change he sought to achieve was something he wouldn't see in his lifetime. I saw this was true after his death. He worked in Indigenous education, as I've said. The main area of focus for him was to build up capacity for First Nations communities to have local control, to teach their children, to teach their kids with autonomy and agency by their own people. He developed programming he called teacher training programs to accomplish this, the most significant of which was likely BUNTEP, Brandon University Northern Teachers Education Program, which is still running today out of UCN, University College of the North, a post-secondary institution that was my dad's dream, which he chaired implementation of. After his death, I was giving a lecture to a room full of Indigenous educators at the Canadian Museum for Human Rights at the Forks in Winnipeg. After the session, many teachers approached me, not about the session I just delivered, but to tell me how my father's work had helped them. The prospect can be daunting. There's so much to be done in so little time. After all, life is short, maybe. Sure. Is it? It's a weird person to quote, maybe, but Tim Robbins, not the actor, the motivational speaker, said to a person in his audience once in a clip that always makes me cry. I look for clips that make me cry. I don't know. I just like crying. My dad said that crying is like pain and grief and all that stuff leaving your body. So crying's good. That you overestimate what you can do in a year, but you underestimate what you can do in a decade. So there is time. You know, I love public speaking. As somebody who lives with mental health struggles, that might sound odd to you, but it's calming for me. Even though I can't quite put a finger on it, I know that generally when I'm on stage in front of people, it relaxes me. I'm so relaxed right now, trust me. And I give talks about, I'm going to have a nap there later, right in front of y'all. I'm just going to sit, lay down. Sarah's going to like just talk to me. I'm just like, what? I mean, anyway. I give talks about a variety of different subjects. They're kind of all stored up in here. They're usually about Indigenous people, cultures, historical and contemporary issues, or mental health, as I've become more of an advocate for that. And I love doing all of it. The only thing I kind of don't love is giving writing workshops. I don't really know how I do what I do. I'm not even convinced that I do it all that well. The little monster on my shoulder, one of many, continually tells me that I have no business teaching somebody else anything about writing, though objectively, I've done okay at the profession. But it's lifelong imposter syndrome. I agree to do workshops here and there, and despite not knowing a lot, I do know a couple of things. Write what you know. That's a shitty piece of advice. I know that much. New and emerging writers get that on the regular. And sure, there's a place for writing what you know. I incorporate it into setting quite often. Many of the stories I write take place in Winnipeg and Kiniseo CP, which is Norio's Cree Nation. In the Mississauga series, Morgan and Eli live in a foster home that used to be a home that I lived in. It's funny, there's a review on Goodreads, which I never read, by the way. It said, that house they live in is so unbelievable. No one ever lived in a house like that. And I almost wrote back, said, actually, I lived in that house. So maybe I get an extra star for that one. They go to River Heights Middle School, and guess what? So did I. And so did Sarah, also, Dr. Kratz. It helps to provide authenticity. Authenticity leads to believability, and that engagement leads to immersion in the story. Of course, that's not all that leads to immersion and engagement, but it plays a part. But you can't only write what you know. You know, we read to learn. And if we read to learn, we certainly write to learn. I've always believed that writing is a practice of exploration. So don't write what you know, but rather write what you want to know. Write to understand the world and your place in it. And yes, write to understand how you can be an active participant in the pursuit of social change, to leave this world better than when you came into it. And if you write what you want to know, if you write what you are passionate about, you will in turn figure out what you ought to do. It'll be different from what I feel I ought to do, and thank God for that. We can't all do the same thing, and we can't all have the same goals or take the same actions. Even if we are all concerned with reconciliation, which is a good goal to have, which is a good ought to do, there is an abundance. There are innumerable roles that we can play to ensure that we get to where we need to go, to find ourselves in a place of healing and community. But whatever you find your role can be, and I will never tell you what that role is, I can say that story plays a part, either in the actions that we take or how we decide what actions we ought to take. And so I wonder if you would indulge me in breaking down as a case study what I'm talking about in an in-depth way. In the process, maybe selfishly, it will give you motivation and a bit of guidance through story to walk this path with Indigenous people. Surely, the road to reconciliation is paved with story. The phrase truth and reconciliation means the two are inextricably linked, reconciliation and truth. While the definition and understanding of what reconciliation means and what it entails are up for discussion, at its most basic, albeit still complex form, it is the act of building community. Truth means what really happened and what is still happening on Turtle Island. For too long, our stories as Indigenous peoples have been told by others. Only recently, within the last 15 years or so, have we been able to reclaim our truth and share it with others through story. This has created a revolutionary change that has ripped apart the fabric of what we thought this country was and has stitched together a new understanding of what this country is. But why not back up a moment? In the interest of continuing to have a fulsome, in-depth conversation, let's look at the word reconciliation and consider whether or not this is what we are trying to do. If on this journey we are seeking to reconcile, after all, how can we accomplish something if we don't truly understand what it is? We may as well try to thrust a hammer into wood with a nail. The act of reconciliation, according to the dictionary, is the restoration of friendly relations. Now, what is an example of true reconciliation? Before my father's work in the field of Indigenous education, he was a minister, and his first pastoral charge was in a small, blinking-you'll-miss-it town called Melita, Manitoba. Not long after conducting his first service, he noticed in the congregation a beautiful young woman. It was my mother. Their courtship and eventual marriage started strong, and if you need evidence of this, I exist. I also have 2 brothers. But my parents stopped when they finally got it right. To be clear, I'm the youngest. Cam, the oldest, he's a little bit uglier than me. He's kind of like, he's 5'10", 5'11", on his tippy toes. He reaches 6 feet sometimes. Mike's like 6'2", and he's a little bit better looking. And I'm the tallest and the best looking. This is what I've been told. During the early years of their marriage, my father became involved in Indigenous education. He evolved into a pioneer in that field, and his work necessitated my family's relocation to Winnipeg. Dad worked hard. He was away from home often, and this was the primary cause of the breakdown of my parents' marriage. They separated in the early 80s, when I was too young to watch Return of the Jedi, and remained separated for over a decade until I entered Kelvin High School in the early 1990s. It's a little over 10 years. My parents didn't find their way back to one another by happenstance. It took hard work. They worked on themselves and then worked on each other when they were ready. You cannot heal brokenness with brokenness, and they knew that. Eventually, they got to the point where they were ready to reconcile, to return to a right relationship, to a restoration of friendly relations. Here's my question. And yes, it is rhetorical. When were relations between Indigenous and non-Indigenous people friendly? In other words, when was there a right relationship? I'm dramatically drink of water while you mull over my rhetorical question. There was not. And there continues to not be. So what are we trying to do here? We don't want to return to anything. Rather, we want to work towards something. We want to build something right for the first time, and then make it sustainable. In order to do that, we not only have to reconsider what reconciliation is, if we should even be calling it that, but what it entails. What stories are we listening to and reading? What are they teaching us, and how are they preparing us? How do these stories motivate us to take action that leads to a sustainable change? When I was younger, I was disconnected from my identity as a Cree person. There are a lot of factors that led to this. My grandmother was a residential school survivor and died without sharing her story. Survivors weren't supported and didn't feel safe to share their experiences back then. And that will always be a lost history. I've learned what I can about Norway House Indian Residential School, but I have not found much specific information about my grandmother. Indian residential school history was not taught in schools in the 80s, or in the 90s really for that matter, or not widely at all until the 2010s. And I didn't learn about the system until I was out of high school. There was an Indian residential school down the street from Kelvin High School, a place where friends of mine, some alive and some who've now passed on, attended. And we never knew that building was there. What a failure. And representation, accurate representation of Indigenous people in popular culture, including literature, forget it. All I saw was the noble savage, the savage Indian, the dead Indian. I never saw anything that represented true indigeneity. The first book I ever read about Indigenous people by an Indigenous person was In Search of April Raintree by Beatrice Maisonnier, then Beatrice Culleton. My coming to as a Cree person was enabled by story. What I learned from my father and his contemporaries after my father's reconciliation with my mother and modestly increasing number of books that were being written about Indigenous people by Indigenous people. Stories are what had an impact on me. They were, and written in oral form, what not only taught me about who I am as a Cree person, but what I needed to do to ensure that what I did helped the most people. That what I could do, I ought to do, even if I was only one person. I mentioned earlier that you should write what you want to know. You try to understand the world and your place in it, and that applies here. The greatest gift in my writing and advocacy has been the knowledge that I have been given, and it's a journey I will always be on, because there's always so much to learn. When my first book was published in 2010, a graphic novel entitled 7 Generations, my focus was on what I'll call reconciliation for the sake of argument. And I equated the reconciliation movement to the Indian residential school story. Though my focus was too narrow, I learned something valuable that I've carried with me for my entire career as a writer, publisher, public speaker, podcaster, etc. If you see something is wrong and you have the capacity to make it right, then you also have a responsibility to make it right. If you see something is missing, that there's a gap that needs to be filled, and you have the ability, then you must fill the gap. Even if people tell you that it cannot be done, they often believe that because it has not been done yet. My first picture book encompasses this truth. I wrote When We Were Alone after reading through the Truth and Reconciliation Commission's calls to action, which stated that Indian residential school history needed to be taught from kindergarten all the way through high school. By that time, I had seen the transformative power of literature when used in an educational setting. But there just wasn't a book about the Indian residential school system for readers that young. I knew that I could write a picture book. I'd read thousands of them. And my first love was poetry. The best picture books incorporate a poet's sensibility. I recognized the gap. There were no picture books for kindergartners about the Indian residential school system. And even though I was told that the topic is too complex and sensitive for young readers, more on that later, I believed there was an approach that would work, that would not traumatize, but instead inform, and more importantly, build empathy. In short, it could be done, it just hadn't been done yet. When We Were Alone went on to win a Governor General's Award, but far more importantly, it is still used in classrooms today to teach young learners about the Indian residential school system. What I've come to understand through lived experience in the books I have published and in the communities I've been fortunate enough to visit is that reconciliation encompasses more than the Indian residential school system. Of course, the residential school system will always be the heart of reconciliation, but it is also one of several systems that have negatively affected Indigenous people, families, and communities. At times, the effect is subtle. It is not readily visible, but is there. My father grew up on a trap line, Blackwater. He was born in 1935, and from 1935 onward, he spent most of his time on the land. That's where he lived, and that's where he played. That's where he worked. That's where he learned, through story and by doing. It is a beautiful way to live. But that way of life was cut short in 1945, when he was 10 years old, by the government's first social assistance program. Why is this system colonial, and how did it disproportionately affect Indigenous people? We need to ask these tough questions. The social assistance program required families who opted to receive monetary support to live at a fixed address. This meant families who lived on the land, because there are no addresses on a trap line, had to make a choice, and many chose to leave that way of life behind. My father said that it broke up the trap for many families. The program also required children to attend school. For Indigenous children, this meant that they would either attend an Indian residential school or a day school. The systems and epidemics that have traumatized and marginalized Indigenous people are profound and far-reaching. They can be traced back centuries. Many of them are still operating today. And the effect on Indigenous communities will be felt for generations to come. This includes the foster care system. When I visit schools, I ask children to put up their hands if they have learned about the Indian residential school system. Every single kid puts their hand up. Progress. Then I ask them to put up their hands if they have learned anything about the foster care system. I rarely see any hands reaching into the air. We aren't doing enough. We have to do more. We have to learn about and in turn teach youth about the 60s scoop and how even today the foster care system may be doing as much damage as the Indian residential school system did. Consider this. There are more Indigenous children in foster care today than at the peak of the Indian residential school system. Out of children in foster care, almost 60% of those children are Indigenous. While in Canada, Indigenous children account for under 8% of all kids under the age of 15. Overrepresentation and mistreatment can be seen time and time again, not only in foster care, but in the justice system. In 2022-2023, Indigenous adults made up 30% of admissions to correctional services, and Indigenous women were incarcerated at a rate 15.4 times higher than non-Indigenous women. What are the causes for this? Marginalization, systemic discrimination, and colonialism. The grandparents will say, my dad always called elders grandparents, will say that healing from the intergenerational impacts of trauma will take 7 generations. But the reality is that the clock hasn't started ticking yet. Trauma is still occurring. We're doing the same things today that we were doing 100 years ago. The healthcare system does not have equitable access or treatment for Indigenous people. Brian Sinclair and my auntie, Olive Kirkness, died because they were left for too long in an emergency room in Winnipeg. And in 2020, in Quebec, Joyce Echequan was laughed at and belittled while she died in their care. Access continues to be a problem in the education system, where many Indigenous children still need to leave home in order to achieve what is a human right, the ability to attain a secondary degree. And then we have epidemics like missing and murdered Indigenous women, girls, and Two-Spirit people. Let me run down some quick stats for you there, but ones that we should all know. Indigenous women, and I have 3 girls. This hits, and I have my wife. It hits very close to home. Indigenous women are 4 times more likely than non-Indigenous women to be victims of violence. They are twice as likely to experience violence from their current or former partner. They are more likely to experience physical and sexual assault than non-Indigenous women. From 2001 to 2014, the average rate of homicides involving Indigenous female victims was 4 times higher than that of those involving non-Indigenous female victims. Indigenous women are 12 times more likely to be murdered or go missing than any other woman in Canada. The government has rightly called the epidemic a genocide. And how are we going to heal? How are we going to achieve reconciliation, to heal ourselves, build good relationships, and reach equitable treatment because we recognize that the success of one person in our community is the success of many? How are we going to walk this path together? Fixing the problems that colonialism has leveled upon Indigenous communities first requires us to recognize there are problems to begin with and what those problems are. We learn from the power of story. We are called to action by the knowledge we are gifted with through story. In writing our stories and listening to the stories that have been shared and what they have to offer, we learn that what we're talking about here, what we want to see in the future, what we want to build, is not only about trauma. Yes, there has been suffering, there is no denying that. But there has been and is great beauty too. There are transformative moments of reclamation. We are taking back our histories in what my pal Richard Van Camp has called a renaissance of Indigenous storytelling. Stories that for so long were told by others, or stories that we are now telling from our own lived experiences. This contributes to the truth when we discuss truth and reconciliation. Writing our truths is a form of activism because people know they should be entitled to the truth, not some alternate version of the truth that attempts to placate, in this case, Canadians with empty and tired rhetoric. Always look for literature from lived experience, but an expansive experience that concerns itself not just with trauma, but with a land-based focus of environmental protection and land stewardship, with language revitalization, because we know that language is our strongest tie to culture. And when we lose it, we lose a part of who we are as Indigenous people. That's why in all of my books now I include the Swampy Cree dialect, because every time I do, I like to think that there's at least one kid who sees their language and feels empowered by it and encouraged to learn it. We are losing the speakers, and it is an area of desperate concern. And how do these things work? When my father died, the language died in our family because due to the impacts of colonialism, of my father's experience in day school and my grandmother's experience at Norway House Indian Residential School, my brothers and I were never taught. It was my father's only regret. Look for literature that concerns itself with cultural preservation, with community, with the beauty of our cultures, values, beliefs, and traditions. Not only so that other people understand and appreciate and respect our differing ways across the many Indigenous cultures on Turtle Island, but so we can hold on to them with a sure and steady grip. Seek out literature that concerns itself with representation and its many levels. Not only accurate, authentic representation of Indigenous peoples across Turtle Island in the writing that we offer, which leads to empowerment for Indigenous people and knowledge and resultant action for non-Indigenous people, but the visibility of Indigenous, BIPOC, and LGBTQI2S+ writers in the classroom. I cannot tell you how important it is to give us that platform, the space and the time to tell our stories. To invite me out to a lecture like this, or my best friend, Sri Demaline, stealing my topic of mental health a few years ago. The visibility of marginalized authors of successful Indigenous people crushes stereotypes and preconceptions which, let's not fool ourselves, are still prevalent today. There remains perceptions, as one example, that Indigenous people are lazy, that we are every bit the tired stereotype that has been ingrained in the public consciousness through years of bombardment. But how does that opinion shift if people knew that, for example, I haven't spent a week at home since December because I've been on the road supporting my work, but most importantly, supporting my family through that work? Or when somebody like Sri Demaline is right there in front of a crowd wrapped in attention, a national bestseller for around 7 years straight, a Governor General's Literary Award winner. I have two of them, by the way. She has one. She has one and I have two. I only said that because she'll watch this on YouTube later and I can rib her again for that. But a Kirkus Prize winner, the Writers' Trust Engel Findlay Award winner, and somebody who's really hard to get a hold of because she's busy in the writing room with Britt Marling, working on a Netflix show called A Murder at the End of the World, or creating a prequel for It that tells the backstory of Pennywise, as Stephen King in her cell phone. Representation extends beyond marginalized voices, beyond the visibility of those voices. And as we are all aware, because of Shri's excellent lecture that also stole my topic, here just a couple years ago into mental health awareness. I'm just kidding, by the way. The Anthology of Monsters is incredible. An epidemic that desperately requires action, the kind of action that can be initiated through the power of storytelling. Now, I don't want to tread on a path that has already been walked on by steady feet. What I can say, as an example of the power of this brand of representation, is that after my memoir on mental health, called All the Little Monsters, we like using monsters in our titles. When we talk about anxiety and depression and panic disorder, and Tree and I both call them our little monsters. It's a good title for it, though. When that memoir came out, I received around, and it came out in January, around 100 emails from people who have read it, who have all in some way been called into action, either for themselves or for others. And why? Because they saw themselves reflected in a book. Simple. And this is not to pat myself on the back. I just want to give you an example of this. This is an email I got today. Just finished All Little Monsters. I didn't realize the extent to which I have anxiety. Your book brought me to several realizations and has gotten me to seek help for my anxiety, still in the very beginning stages. But I do believe you have transformed my life and changed the path in which I was heading. So accurate, representative literature should also be a human right. Everybody should have the ability and access to see themselves in a story or learn about the lives of others who live in this community with us, which leads to understanding, love, and respect. It reminds me of a teaching my father gave me, a Cree teaching called non-interference. You don't interfere with how another person lives. Rather, if anything, you model what it means to live a good life, what it means to seek a good life. What in Cree and Anishinaabe we call Minalpamatsuan, which is the good life. What greater action can there be? How much more effective can activism be than building a community based on those principles of love, understanding, and acceptance? The actions of one turns into the actions of many. I often think of the starfish analogy. We all know it. There's a boy on the beach filled with starfish that have been brought in with the tide and left to die. The boy is throwing the starfish into the water, one after the other. An impossible task, given that he is but one on a beach full of sea creatures. An older man asks the boy why he's doing it, because he can't possibly make a difference with all the starfish there on the beach. The boy throws another starfish into the ocean and says that he made a difference to that one. There's more to the story, though. At least, I like to imagine there is. After seeing the boy doing this work, the old man joins in. And upon seeing the two folks throwing starfish into the ocean, a crowd of onlookers on the beach contribute to the cause. And soon, there is a community of people taking part, and by the end of the day, there is not one starfish left. Who were those people who helped the boy throw those starfish back into the ocean? Well, social activism is not just what we write about, not just the stories you tell, but who you are writing for. When I made the decision of what I wanted to write about, what I wanted to help change, I also had to decide on who I was going to fight for and with. I had to decide who would be my agents of change in this work of social activism. I asked myself in the decision-making process, what segment of the population has the greatest capacity, who has the best chance to create meaningful and lasting social change? The answer was self-evident. The answer has always been youth. And while writing may not provide the same immediate impact as a protest or demonstration, while it may lack a similar sense of urgency in that immediacy, it compensates with an ability to reach a wide audience, and its effectiveness as a method of activism rests within the audience you choose to consider. Words in a written and oral form are permanent. I often think of the story I based my fantasy novel The Barren Grounds on, the Fisher Stars constellation, or Ochek. It's an old story. How old, I'm not certain, but older than the story most people think The Barren Grounds is based on, The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. That's fair, though. When I sold this book to Penguin, I pitched it as an Indigenous Narnia. I kind of asked for that one, but it's calculated. Time has no hold over it. In fact, from wherever that story originated, if anything, this traditional story, among many others, has broadened its reach. In researching constellation stories, I found multiple versions across geographical areas and throughout many different Indigenous cultural groups. Stories don't die, and so the messages laced within them don't die either. Words then overcome environmental and situational barriers in order to capture the receiver's attention, encouraging them through engagement to pause and reflect on the ideas conveyed, the meaning between the lines, and there is no segment of the population more adept at pulling meaning from between the lines than children. Maurice Sendak, one of my literary heroes, said once of youth, "I don't believe that there's a demarcation." Oh, you mustn't tell them that. You mustn't tell them that. You tell them anything you want. You tell them if it's true. If it's true, you tell them. Children are willing to open themselves up to experiences. We aren't. Adults always say they protect their children, but they're really protecting themselves. Besides, when it comes to stories, I know I've said this before, but it bears repeating, you can't and shouldn't protect children. They know everything already. They unlearn things with an adult's particular brand of protection. Sendak said that adults read at more of a surface level, if they read anything at all. Case in point, book challenges. While children dig in. This is one of my great joys in my life. I get to visit probably about 150 classrooms a year. And I see it every single time. In every single class I go to, I see it. They dig in and they uncover meaning. They don't just read between the lines, they burrow in and excavate lessons inherent in stories. The activism they are and the activism that they promote. And children have had, in my experience, a tremendous influence. I have seen what they have done when it comes to book bannings. They have taken it upon themselves in entire school divisions to rewrite land acknowledgements, to accurately move from sentiment to intentionality. They led the renaming of a school that used to be Ryerson Elementary in Winnipeg. It wasn't the teachers or the parents that led that charge, it was the kids. And when we picture the leaders in environmental protection, who are the first people to come to mind? Political leaders? Adults? No. Autumn Pelche, Greta Thunberg, youth. Our job is to equip children with knowledge so that they can do the work of social change, to immerse them with story, with the written and spoken word from lived experiences, from once muted, marginalized voices, to make better decisions than have been made in the past. I carry my father's words in his consideration of the pathway to building a better future. A pathway, like me, he believed to be forged with story in the hands of youth. My father's quote, "In terms of looking at the future, we have a responsibility to look at our own 7 generations from where we are and to look into the future. We want to look back to see what happened. We want to experience what's happening here and now, but we want to look forward into the future and develop a vision of it that will help, that will give us hope, that will give young people hope, that will give children hope in terms of what it is they want to look forward to. The future hasn't happened yet. The future will be what we determine it to be in the next 7 generations. That's where our control is and where we need to look ahead to. I don't know your role, and even if I did, I wouldn't tell you. Intention and action mean less if it's prescriptive. What I do know is that you have a role. We all do. The beginning of the pathway is figuring out what you can do and what you ought to do. Thank you.
Thank you. That was wonderful. You're a great reader, by the way. I know this is a thing you don't do.
I know.
I don't know. You haven't convinced me.
I'm not used to
beautiful.
So I'm used to literally being given a topic.
Yeah.
And then just go.
Yeah.
And just make it up.
Okay.
So anyway, it was different. It was a different experience.
This is one of the ways in which you and I were always yin and yang. As Dave mentioned, we've known each other for a long time, although this is the first time we've seen each other in person in 30 years.
Yeah.
It's pretty special to be sitting up here on the stage with you.
Yeah.
We were good friends in high school in the early years of University of Winnipeg. Then I left Winnipeg and we lost touch, Social media wasn't what it is back then. But I followed your career with such interest. It's been great to reconnect and finally have you here talking about the wonderful stuff that you do. Okay, one of the ways in which you and I are yin and yang, though, is that you don't like to write anything down, and I write everything down. So I've got like all these questions on all my papers, and I'm just leaning in to that.
I didn't let you show me any questions beforehand. I didn't want that.
Yeah, no.
Yeah.
No.
Yeah.
So brave.
This is a surprise. That's a surprise.
I envy you. It's a gift. I want to begin by asking you about high school because we shared so many experiences. And because I know that there are high school teachers and education students in this audience. You mentioned one experience that we shared, although we were in different English classes, when we read In Search of April Raintree. What you didn't mention tonight, but we talked about it the other day, was that we were reading the censored classroom version. It was redacted. Even those really important stories and voices were not always given to us in full. This was maybe the first time, because our high school, our English teacher told us, by the way, this is the classroom redacted version, but you can go to the library and read the full one. And so that's what we did. And this was the first time, I think, that I remember starting to think about the stories that were missing for us in our classrooms. And we never really talked about this, though. But you had the same experience, and then you wrote a paper about it in university. But we never talked about this, and it strikes me that so often we just don't know what stories we are missing. My first question to you is, you knew you wanted to be a writer back then. When did you know what the gaps were that you wanted to fill with your writing? When did you know what it was you had been missing?
It was pretty slow progression. I certainly didn't know in high school. It was actually in university when I read April Raintree the first time. It was early university. And I wrote a paper about the censorship of the scene. It was the rape scene that was the heavily redacted part of the April Raintree. Just to address that quickly, we talk a lot about like age appropriateness, That's what some of this comes down to is, I often say like you can write anything for anybody. You can, everything should be written about and kids should have access to it. The caveat is making sure that it's age appropriate for them, like building up towards the ability to unpack a complex and very difficult scene like that in Beatrice's book. If a high school student is not ready to read that scene or read about abuse at residential schools or to address, the murder of Helen Betty Osborne in the PA in 1971, we failed them because we haven't prepared them to be able to read about those things without a traumatizing experience. I look at it often as the same way as we look at math, for example. So math, like when do we start teaching math? Like kindergarten, right? In school. And then we build up so that by the time we're in high school, we can teach calculus, which I dropped. But,
Me too.
yeah. Just some of us are math people. Anyway, but for the longest time, even when we were teaching residential school history, we were waiting. We were waiting and waiting until like grade 8 or 9. Then we started teaching it. We ignored it for like 8 years. Then we started teaching it. We didn't ignore math for 8 years. Started teaching it. So we needed to lay a foundation at an early age. That's where When We Were Alone came in. Let's start with the principles. We'll talk about it in ways that aren't traumatic or scary. And we'll build up. So by the time a kid's in grade 10, they can read, Broken Circle by Teddy Fontaine. They can read that book and they'll be able to get what we need them to get from it. So we need to build up in that way. We need to consider age appropriateness. The gaps, I became aware of them more in the university. And then as I went forward in my journey to just really identity discovery, and figuring out what it meant for me to be Cree, and mostly from my father, and finding out more about his work, and then reading more and more books by, like Thomas King, for example, was an early hero of mine, and then you become more aware of not just like yourself, but you become more aware of what was missing, what is still missing. Because when you start to seek out things, you find they're not there. It was about 2005 or 6 when I started thinking about writing about Indigenous people. I've always loved writing, but I wanted to write about something like that would almost give kids something that I didn't get to have when I was younger. And so the first book I ever wrote was about Helmut Osborne. That was because there wasn't any graphic novel like it that had ever been done. And so I just felt like, I mean, we need to know about this story. What's the best like vehicle? And that was graphic novels. To me, that was comics. That was the best vehicle. So it's always been a question of like, what are the gaps? Can I fill the gaps? And how do I fill the gaps? And who do I fill the gaps for? That's why it's like, maybe it's a picture book, maybe it's a comic book, maybe it's a novel. But it is looking at what needs to be there and what isn't. And so I became more aware of that probably about 25 years ago, around there.
You spoke so inspiringly. Is that a word, inspiringly?
I think so.
I think so.
I don't have an editor, so they make sure that I sound smart, but I don't know. I make up a lot of words when I write books.
You spoke in such inspiring ways about youth tonight and about the hope that they bring to you. And I want to ask you a little bit more in a minute about your visits with them, like that part of your job. But I'm also remembering something you said just the other day, and it kind of follows on track with lots of your recent work, your memoirs, nonfiction, literary fiction. And you said you're ready to write more for adults. So what does that shift to an adult audience mean for you in the context of thinking about this impetus for social change in your writing and who you're writing for?
In a roundabout way, writing for adults is preparing, in some ways, adults to work with children. So I think it's still about kids in a way. Let's take, for example, like all Little Monsters, like my mental health memoir. I became really intimately aware of the mental health epidemic in Canada in working with kids. When I do work with kids, and I was talking about, like I did use, when I was early on in my career, I used like characters as a proxy for me. Connor mentioned The Reckoner Rises. There's a character named Cole Harper who has like panic disorder, anxiety. That character was a way for me to talk about mental health with younger people, middle years, senior years. And whenever I did a talk on mental health through that book in classrooms, almost every single classroom I went to, a kid would come to me and they would say, I'm going through that. And I couldn't believe how pervasive it was. And I was just in Hamilton, like in January, talking about this book, because it's used a lot in high schools now already. I had a panic attack while I was giving it. Talked about this in the green room. I really do love public speaking, but I had a panic attack because sometimes they just come while I was giving a talk, and I kind of just like when I worked through it. So like I got my feet kind of steady. I felt a little dizzy. Just tried to keep my train of thought like somewhat like understandable, and I got through it. But I felt like, when it was over, I felt like, oh, they wasted money bringing me here, And then that's that other little monster that's like, you're useless. Like, they paid for you to come here, and what did you do? You came here and you had a panic attack. And what did the kids learn from you? And so I was really being hard on myself. And I actually went to the organizer right after the speech I gave. I was apologizing to her. I was telling her I'm so sorry. Like, I usually don't do that. I feel like I'm pretty good at speaking usually, and I really messed that up. And I was actually going to offer to give them some money back. And then I got a tap on my shoulder, and I turned around. There was a kid there, and it was like a girl in grade 10 maybe. And you look at her, you never know there's anything wrong. Like like everything was put together, like super smart, articulate, like good-looking young woman. And she's just like, excuse me, Mr. Robertson. And I said, yeah. She said, I'm in that hole too. And because I talked about depression as a deep hole. And she says, I'm in that hole. And she kind of told me a little bit about it for a minute. And I said, I'm really sorry to hear that. But, it'll be okay, And then she just said okay, and she just turned around and walked away. And she just wanted to tell me. So kids are going through it way more than we think. And we need to be equipped to deal with that, to help them. And to do that, we need to learn about, first of all, we face our own monsters, our own anxieties, our own depression, our own panic disorder. I'm sure people in this room have it. Not everybody, but some. Probably more than you like to think. You learn more about it in your own life, and then you're able to help somebody else face it in their own life too. And the best way you can do that is to tell your story and to understand more about your story. And I think that's what is the same answer for what you're asking, is I want people to understand more about the things I'm writing about. Theory of Crows is like about loss of a parent. It's about family dysfunction. It's about land-based healing. It's about all these things that we can bring to youth if we learn about that in our own lives. So I think a lot of it is, I don't want to ignore you. I love writing for everybody, but I want us to always be ready to guide the youth so that they can do the work, and because we've given them this burden that we need to prepare them for. I write for adults because I think I like writing adult literature, but I also want them to be prepared to be good role models and guides for kids.
It's a very intergenerational way of thinking.
Yeah.
About adult writing and youth writing. And
well, it is. Everything's
connected,
intergenerational. I went to the chaplain with my father in 2018, a year before he passed away, and we spent the day out there together. And the next year I took my kids, and I taught them what my dad taught me. It was like my dad was teaching them, and my dad died that year. And so if he hadn't taught me, I wouldn't be able to teach them. And that was a gift. But everything's intergenerational. Everything's passed down knowledge. Everything we pass down to someone else that we've learned as a gift is a gift we give to somebody else.
That's such a beautiful thought to conclude on. And thank you so much.
Thank you.